Hello and welcome to Thoughtcast, the video product from The Hindu, which gives you an in-depth analysis and looks very deeply at opinion page articles which are timely and relevant in this news cycle. I'm Narayan Lakshman, Senior Associate Editor and Opinion Editor at The Hindu, and I'm very pleased to bring you today episode 3 of Thoughtcast. Today we have with us Prashanth Perumal, Assistant Editor at The Hindu. Prashanth, thank you for joining us. And we'll be looking very deeply at the question of inequality, which of course is a concept that has been around for ages in the field of economics and development economics in particular, but has exploded in the public discourse in India in recent times, owing to the conversation around the election, manifestos, and whether the Congress party actually does support an inheritance tax, and there are questions of redistribution of wealth. So thank you again for joining us, Prashanth. I look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you.
So the latest discussion on this subject obviously began after Sam Pitroda, who's linked to the Congress party, not resident in India sometimes, spoke out online and in a video about the idea of an inheritance tax. Obviously looking at how the US has an inheritance tax, but it's not only the US. Japan, for example, even has an inheritance tax of up to 55%. But as a concept, it was something new in India. So Prashanth, why was there such consternation? And what are the questions that the concept of inheritance tax raises, which is new to all of us in India?
Well, the whole point of the inheritance tax, the topic of the inheritance tax came up because the perception that we've got a lot of inequality, and that was kind of showcased recently, a month and a half ago, by the paper by Piketty, the famous inequality expert, the economist, and he's come up with very significant figures based on different sources, and I can probably go into a little bit on what exactly is the essence of it. So what he says is he looks basically into the inequality figures right from the British Raj, right around 1920s to actually 2012, 2013. And what we see is that particularly after independence, if you see, we see that the bottom 50% as well as the middle 40%, that's the bottom 90% of India's population, excluding the top 10%. We see that their income as well as their wealth shares have dropped significantly. So the bottom 50% has dropped from around 20% in 1952 to around, let's say, 15 to 14%. And the bottom, the middle class, that's the middle 40%, their income shares, or also even the wealth, this is the income shares, it's dropped from around 42, 43% in 1952 to around a little under, between 25 to 30%. So their wealth shares, the income and as well as their wealth shares as well have dropped. But we also see that the top 10%, they've actually grown at the cost of. Cost would be the wrong word, but you see that obviously we're talking about the percentage. So the income shares of the top 10% has increased from around 36, 37% in 1952 to it's close to almost 60% today. So that's the finding that Piketty's come up with, and so in the Pitroda probably is deriving his figures from the his opinion from there. So he says that tax the top 10%, the top 1% particularly, and give that money to the rest of the population so that we can balance this out. Absolutely. And there are implications to that, and we'll discuss this as we go
absolutely.
forward. Yeah, sure.
So I was going to say, Prashanth and a few others this week have written articles on the subject of inequality, looking at it purely from the point of view of economics, but also linking that to the broader political scenario in India. And I guess, Prashanth, the obvious question that comes up is, when you have the shares of income and wealth of the lower and middle segments dropping, what does that imply in terms of their own capabilities, their own participation in the economy, and what can their future prospects be in such a scenario?
Okay, economists generally, whoever writes on the inequality, they actually see this as a worrying sign. They see that they see that you have fewer opportunities for the middle 40% and the bottom 50%. But now that's not necessarily the case, because we see that most of the income, the trends actually show that from the 1950s to 1980s, when India was under Nehru's socialist policy, we see that income inequality actually kind of dropped. And then after liberalization, as from Rajiv Gandhi's times and Manmohan Singh's time, as liberalization happened, we see that that's when we have both income inequality as well as wealth inequality shooting up. But what we see also economically is that the economy grew at a much faster pace. So it's grown around 3.6% after the 1990s or something, if I'm not wrong. But in the decades before that, it's got like 1.6 or 1.5. Yes. So we see that that's a 2 percentage point difference makes a huge difference to the living standards, not just of the people who are seeing their income shares rise, but also of the bottom 50% or even the middle class. Yeah. The bottom 50% and the middle class, even they are having higher living standards today. So that's a little bit of a interpretation that you need to make. Just because your wealth shares or the income shares are dropping doesn't necessarily mean that you're worse off in terms of absolute numbers, your living standards. Right. So that's a little bit of a nuance involved in that. Correct. So you can't just look at the wealth shares and decide. Okay. But yeah, we can also look into in a competitive economy, how would things be otherwise? Do you think we would have a similar wealth share on like income shares that we have today? Yeah. Would that exist in a competitive economy? Probably not. Yeah. Because if we can go in deeper into that right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess my question, which you kind of hinted at, is that when you have these shares dropping, even when the absolute levels of income are rising, what are the manifestations of that particular income distribution, let's say on productivity of workers in factories? So for example, there are questions of who owns capital. Yeah. And for example, the elites who are at the top of the pyramid tend to be owners of capital. Yes. And they're able to leverage, let's say, for example, technology, and they therefore continue to get value at that high level. Yes. Does that beg the question of, therefore, when you have such an income distribution and wealth distribution, should you allow entrepreneurs and those with capital to create their plants and factories and also create jobs, but then somehow intervene at some stage in that process so that the value and wealth coming out of that is distributed in a different way to what pure market forces would allow? So we're talking about a level of intervention versus pure market forces. What's your view on that?
Well, if you look at it, like the pure market forces would actually ensure that capital gets accumulated. The people who run businesses well, there is a certain thing. When you make profits as a business, when you're talking about a pure free market economy, it means that you've added value to the consumer. Yeah. But that's the disclaimer that there is that not all businesses are making profits because they're actually the most competitive in the economy. There are also other political forces that the top 1% may be able to deliver on. They're probably like we saw with the electoral bonds issue. The top 1% are the ones who are contributing money. Absolutely. So do they
and actually? The bonds, in a sense, further cemented those connections, which make it possible.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can't really say that we're talking about a competitive economy right now. Yeah. So maybe when we have a lot more competitive economy, maybe the top 1% or the top 10% share would be a lot lower. Okay. I'm not sure because it's an empirical question and we can't really forecast that. It's pretty hard to do that. But I think when you get rid of these political connections that the top 1% has, because they're funders, and that's a larger question of election funding and stuff. My guess is that there would be a lot more mobility across classes. Right. We'll have a lot more people from the top bottom 50% and the middle 40% going into the top 10%, and you'll also find some people from the top 10% or the top 1% actually moving into the lower pyramids, lower sections of the pyramid, right? Yeah. So that's a sign of a healthy competitive economy. Yeah. So we need to look more than inequality. We need to look at income mobility and and maybe like a wealth mobility. How are people moving through the different sections of the pyramid? Right. So that's a little more important thing we need to look at. And talking about how exactly wealth is distributed. Like I said, I started my answer with that. In a pure competitive, even in a pure competitive economy, you're going to be having the best capital allocators. Entrepreneurs are actually getting a lot more money, but you'll also see a lot more mobility across sections, and that's also in a way that's efficient because you're making sure that the capitalists was the best people who actually can allocate in the best way. Right. And that actually has implications for the living standards of the bottom 50% as well. Correct. Because you're talking about huge resources in the economy. Okay. You want people who are the best at allocating it, who can be the most innovative in using the resources to produce goods for the market, right? So in that case, there is a social benefit there is to it, Right. So that benefits the bottom 50%, the middle class as well. Right. So there's a trade, So you need to look at
that. I guess that raises an interesting question of when you have entrepreneurs doing well and getting their fair value for their contributions, what is happening with the rest of the lower half of the pyramid, the lower part of the pyramid, is people who aspire to reach the entrepreneurial class through the educational achievements need to be able to do so. And in order to do so, they need both the educational and, for example, even healthcare provision, public provision, that puts them on that level playing field and makes that mobility possible. So does this desire for a competitive situation and competitive economy not automatically imply that the playing field has to be leveled through these interventions?
Yeah, absolutely. You need for the bottom 50% and the middle 40% to go up the ladder. You want them to have, better education, better access to capital and things like that. But the question here is, how do you provide that? Because what we see in India is the whole question mark over state capacity. But just because you're going to put more money into a certain sector doesn't necessarily mean that the output is going to be good, particularly with education. Just doubling right now, if you're going to double the education budget, it doesn't necessarily mean that education standards are going to get better by 2 times, right? So it's similarly with healthcare and stuff. So the question is also about how do you get there, right? So one way is to increase, look at health and education as public goods and provide them that way. Or you can look at them as private goods, but then when you talk about private goods in India, health and education is private goods. The general perception that people have is that the huge schools or the elite schools, they charge a lot of fees. Similarly, the elite corporate hospitals, they can charge a lot of money. But we're talking about a very uncompetitive market, particularly with these sectors. If you want to start a school or to start a hospital, it takes again a lot of political connections, something that only the top 1% or the top 10% actually get into. That's why you see those. So what's the cost of that? The cost of that is that you have higher prices, right? The cost of healthcare, the cost of education is high, which means that you're still putting the bottom 50% and a significant part of the middle 40% of the economy away from access to these goods, right? So you probably need something like a 1991 type liberalization that happened with the manufacturing sector, and you de-licensed a lot of things, right? Which helped these sectors actually up their supply, So you up your supply, that leads to lower prices, and that makes a good more accessible to a wider section of the population. So you need, in my opinion, that's what you need. You need these sectors that are considered to be public goods need to be protected for the social welfare of the people. I think the market forces will actually help you lower the prices of healthcare as well as education and make it more accessible to the bottom 40%, the middle 40%, and that will help you, more income mobility, more wealth mobility. So that's one approach. But the other approach that most economists, when they talk about inequality, and what you see is that when inequality experts are usually left of center, so their prescriptions are also, they talk about all the figures, and which is very, very informative. But then the conclusion, the policy prescription that they offer is more taxes. Right, and that kind of goes completely against the liberalization view that right. So even the inequality experts who are talking about a little more, not extremely left of center, they say kind of balance. The taxes don't go for too much, but kind of keep it balanced. They still don't go for the liberalized. But by the end of the day, to make anything cheaper, you need to up the supply, and taxes are not going to help you up the supply and lower prices.
So I think that you raise a very important point on the taxes, and a couple of issues to unpack there. So in this latest conversation, linking the inequality discussion to the manifestos and the election cycle, is the question of inheritance tax versus wealth tax. So firstly, I want to ask you, what do you think makes the difference between those two? Because inheritance tax, in a sense, you're looking at almost intergenerational issues. And the second is tax, is what you said earlier, the very important point about capacity, state capacity. So tax is at the root of that, and don't you need taxation to kind of really reach a certain critical threshold for the government to be able to finance these interventions, alongside what you said is those making it more competitive, breaking those political economic connections and increasing the supply of hospitals and schools. So these two questions, inheritance tax versus wealth tax, and then the question of, is a major shift in the tax, for example, even an indirect tax, do we need to change the way it works, because it contributes a large share of total tax revenue, and it is a regressive tax in that sense.
When it comes to increasing taxation to increase tax collection to maybe is that going to lead to better state capacity? I'm not sure. People would have different opinions because some set of scholars say that we don't tax enough and that's why we don't get it. We don't have enough state capacity.
Or maybe we don't have sufficient monitoring and collection methods. There are all kinds of conversations on how you can make those sharp and actually dent the tax avoidance that happens at the upper level.
Yes, but I do remember maybe some years ago, the first 5 years of the Modi government, I saw that the revenues, the central government's tax revenues almost doubled.
Okay.
And did we see an equivalent or even a significant improvement in the provision of public goods? I don't think so. Right? So I think so. It's a lot more than funds. It's got to do with incentives. Why is it that things why is it that public servants, despite getting a lot more in revenues, why aren't they providing an equal amount of goods, public goods? So there's something that's wrong with the incentives facing public servants or the politicians. So that's a deeper question to get into. And the other question was about
inheritance versus.
I'm sure there are differences in terms of, because given the longer time frame that we're looking at, the time frames that we're looking for when it comes to the wealth tax versus the inheritance tax, there could be differences, but at the end of the day, it has an incentive effect on investors or whatever the wealthy people. So if you're going to impose a greater tax, people are going to adjust people whoever has the money, whenever they invest, they're also going to make a certain margin adjustment for the fact that they're going to have to pay a lot more as taxes. Correct. So how do they make a margin adjustment? They're going to pay lesser to the inputs that we're talking about labor, we're talking about other factors of production, right? Yeah. So what you essentially have at the end of the day, you're not really taxing the rich, the investors, the rich who have capital. They can always adjust how much they invest and other adjustments like taxes, and all this stuff to make sure
impacting the product.
Yeah, exactly.
The sector,
the product.
The
product, the inputs, and everything else. They maintain their wealth share.
Right.
So it's the others who basically at the end of the day, the government is actually taxing the others, not the top 1% or the 10%, but the other population who would actually benefit in other ways. Okay. So that's.
So just to wrap it up, bring it back to where we began, which is the whole election and manifesto question. Regardless of who said what and who is distorting what is in the manifesto, do you think there is any likelihood or way in which India will move forward towards a different regime of either tax or tax plus redistribution, or as the third option, tax plus redistribution plus incentivizing, leveling the playing field, improving supply, which you mentioned and we talked about as a critical third element. What do you see happening as we move forward from this election?
I think over the last 10 years itself, we've seen a lot more taxes happening. So we are in a trend of more burden on the citizens in terms of taxes. And we don't get enough, like I said, we don't get enough in the way of public provision of goods. But the more worrying thing is, we are not focusing on improving the size of the economic pie. There have been no significant reforms in the last, not even the 10 years, maybe in the last 15 to 20 years. But the point right now, we're not even talking about reforms. That's a whole new atmosphere that we're talking about. At least in UPA, 10 years of UPA, we saw people talking about reforms. That's the agenda, although we didn't have significant reforms. But in the last 10 years, we see that there's talk about growth and stuff, but there's not actually been significant reforms, and that's what's forcing a lot of people to actually question the growth figures and stuff like that. Okay. So can you repeat the question again?
On where you see it going from here. Taxes may continue to go up and down from time to time. Maybe.
The overall cycle could be that at some point when if you don't have enough reforms, the growth is going to suffer, and that's going to make it harder because a more vibrant economy gets you more taxes. So as you go, as the economy doesn't actually do well, you'll see that your tax collection also is going to get harder and harder. So at some point, it's probably happening already. The taxmen are going to be put more pressure on citizens, on businesses, and that's going to make the economy even worse. But at some point, maybe at the breaking point, you will see that the policymakers would understand that you're trying to tax too much and, you know, trying to kill the goose, the golden goose.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the point where we will actually have reforms. They understand that, you know, it's more important to focus on liberalization, doing something more. So that's how it works in India. I think the trend, we don't do it actually until we actually
reform by marginal increase. One step forward, two steps back. Okay, thank you, Prashanth. And just to wrap up our discussion today, so we began with looking at how the question of inequality first emerged in this context in terms of the Congress's manifesto, which actually doesn't talk about inheritance tax, but the Prime Minister did allude to that in his campaign speeches. And then it became sort of a bogeyman, a fear that was raised. And then that has raised important questions about whether an inheritance tax could work. And then therefore, do you need wealth taxes and changes in income tax? Should we be looking at how indirect taxes are regressive? So from that question, we went on to look at how in the trajectory of Indian history and economic history, inequality has risen, but at the same time, in the last several decades, the absolute share of what the lower sections get has increased because the overall size of the pie has increased. Prashanth, of course, made the interesting point that the need of the hour is to increase the size of the pie even further, thereby not getting in the way of economic growth. But the nuance in our conversation, I think, came out earlier, which is to say that to truly level the playing field and to make it competitive and increase the supply of critical factors of production and goods and services that the lower sections consume, like healthcare and education, these need to be provided by the state. Of course, to some extent, the government does need resources and tax revenue, therefore, to provide that. But at the same time, it's about finding that balance between taxing to the right amount to finance this versus not overtaxing and, as you poignantly put it, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. So India is at that tricky phase where we don't necessarily follow the the Kuznets curve, the inverted U curve on inequality strictly leads to better outcomes, but at the same time we are on a tightrope in terms of getting the taxation right, getting the type of taxes right, but most importantly, Prashanth, as you concluded, getting the reforms done, moving the needle on who is controlling access to government, which reforms are possible and not, breaking certain power relationships maybe, but getting reforms done that change the way resources are allocated on the ground. So with that, we'll wrap it up. But thank you very much, Prashanth, for joining us for this very insightful and nuanced discussion.
Thanks for the opportunity. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.